Toward sunrise, David managed to intercept part of the outgoing data stream, confirming that Marcus intended to leak not just corporate secrets, but manipulated financial records designed to implicate Jonathan in fraud. If released, even temporarily, the stock market reaction could be catastrophic before the truth emerged. In a risky maneuver, Jonathan decided to bait Marcus, sending a message from Victoria's phone agreeing to deliver the next set of files in person at an abandoned waterfront warehouse Marcus had specified for future exchanges. The plan was to confront him, retrieve the code, and stall him long enough for David to neutralize the server completely. Victoria insisted on accompanying Jonathan despite the danger, arguing that Marcus trusted her presence, and Elena shocked them both by volunteering to come as well, claiming Marcus would be less guarded if he believed she remained uninvolved. After a tense debate, Jonathan agreed, recognizing that Elena's insight into Marcus's behavior could prove crucial. The warehouse meeting unfolded like a scene from a thriller. Cold wind whipping off the harbor, footsteps echoing on concrete, Marcus emerging from the shadows with a smug smile that faltered when he saw Jonathan standing beside Victoria. He recovered quickly, brandishing a small remote device and reminding them of the server's countdown, confident in his leverage. But what Marcus had not anticipated was Elena stepping forward and addressing him by a nickname from their past, a name that triggered visible unease. She spoke calmly about the cameras she had disabled and the server vulnerabilities Jonathan's team had already exploited, planting seeds of doubt about his control over the situation. As Marcus's confidence wavered, Jonathan engaged him in conversation about his firing months earlier, subtly provoking him into boasting about the scheme and revealing details about the code storage on his encrypted phone. At a critical moment, Elena deliberately stumbled, knocking the remote from Marcus's hand, and Victoria seized the distraction to grab his phone while Jonathan tackled him to the ground. The scuffle was brief but intense, ending with Marcus restrained by arriving police, alerted earlier by Elena's cousin, and the device secured. Back at the estate, David successfully entered the failsafe code and dismantled the leak sequence minutes before expiration, averting public disaster. In the aftermath, as dawn painted the sky pink over manicured lawns, Jonathan stood in his once impeccable office and felt a humbling shift inside himself. The illusion of total control he had cultivated for decades lay shattered, replaced by a raw awareness of vulnerability and the realization that loyalty cannot be measured by paychecks or titles. Victoria, exhausted but resolute, admitted that her fear of tarnishing Jonathan's image had nearly cost them everything, and they spoke honestly for the first time in years about the pressure his empire placed on their marriage. And Elena, quiet, steady Elena, tried to fade back into the background, but Jonathan stopped her, acknowledging that without her courage, intuition, and willingness to risk her job and safety, his company and family might have imploded. He offered her not just a bonus or promotion, but a full scholarship fund for her younger brother's college education and a permanent role in the company's internal security division, recognizing her keen eye for threats others overlooked. Yet the final twist came weeks later, when investigators discovered that Marcus had not acted alone. The anonymous email that first alerted Jonathan had indeed been sent by Elena, but the blurred photograph attached to it had been staged by Victoria herself days before Marcus ever entered the house. An image she had created during a harmless business dinner to test whether Jonathan would notice something was wrong, if given a hint. A desperate attempt to gauge whether their marriage still held enough connection for him to come home early. She confessed this through tears, fearing Jonathan would see it as manipulation, but he instead saw it as a cry for attention drowned out by board meetings and investor calls. The layers of deception, some malicious, some protective, wove together into a sobering truth. The greatest threats to a man's empire are not always external hackers or rival executives, but silence, pride, and emotional distance. In the end, Marcus faced federal charges. The company emerged stronger with fortified systems, and Jonathan restructured his life, delegating more responsibility so he could rebuild trust at home, often recalling the moment his maid had whispered, "Stay quiet," and realizing that those two words had saved more than just data. They had saved his family. And so, to everyone watching, remember this. Power without awareness is fragile. Wealth without trust is hollow. And sometimes the hero of the story is the one no one notices until she steps out of the shadows and changes everything. Sensitive files. Elena had overheard fragments while cleaning and realized something was wrong. But Victoria had begged her not to call the police, fearing a scandal that would destroy Jonathan's company and reputation. Jonathan's fury now had direction, but he forced himself to stay still as Marcus finished extracting data and shoved a flash drive into his pocket, warning Victoria that he would return for more unless she followed instructions. When Marcus finally exited through the back patio doors, disappearing into the darkness, Jonathan stepped forward at last, and Victoria gasped when she saw him, shock and relief colliding in her expression before she broke down sobbing. The confrontation that followed was raw and chaotic. Victoria confessed that Marcus had approached her at a charity gala weeks earlier, hinting at irregularities in Jonathan's early financial records, records that, while not illegal, could be twisted into something scandalous. And when she dismissed him, he escalated, sending threatening messages and eventually showing up at the estate with proof he had already breached minor systems within the company. Terrified of public disgrace and the collapse of shareholder trust, she had tried to handle it quietly, believing she could stall him long enough for Jonathan to return from his travel schedule, but each visit tightened the noose. Jonathan listened in stunned silence, anger flickering not at her, but at himself for building a fortress of technology that still left his family vulnerable. Elena stood awkwardly nearby until Victoria suddenly turned to her and whispered, "Tell him the rest." Elena hesitated before revealing that Marcus had installed hidden cameras in the house to ensure compliance, cameras she had discovered earlier that evening while dusting a smoke detector that seemed slightly misaligned. Instead of confronting Marcus, she had discreetly disabled the visible devices and texted a cousin who worked in local law enforcement for advice, all while waiting anxiously for an opportunity to warn Jonathan if he returned. The realization hit Jonathan like a tidal wave. The anonymous email that prompted his early return had likely been sent by Elena, who must have found a way to access his travel itinerary and send the blurry photograph to provoke suspicion strong enough to bring him home without alerting Marcus. He looked at her, and she lowered her gaze, admitting she had taken that risk because she feared Victoria was in over her head and believed only Jonathan's presence could stop the spiral. In that moment, the power dynamic of the household shifted permanently. The maid he had barely spoken to beyond polite greetings had orchestrated the one move that might save his empire. But the night was far from over, because as Jonathan reached for his phone to call his head of security, Elena's face drained of color, and she whispered that Marcus had mentioned a failsafe, something that would trigger if Victoria or anyone else tried to contact authorities before he retrieved the next batch of data. Panic surged again. Jonathan knew men like Marcus did not bluff, and the possibility of a timed data leak or planted evidence spreading across the internet could devastate everything he had built. Thinking faster than he had in years, Jonathan retreated to his office and began scanning his systems manually, bypassing company networks to avoid detection, while Victoria and Elena searched the house for any remaining devices. What they uncovered was more chilling than expected: microtransmitters hidden behind picture frames, under tables, even inside a decorative vase in the foyer, all feeding into a central receiver concealed in the garage. As Jonathan disabled each signal, he traced its origin and found a remote server set to release encrypted packets of stolen data to major news outlets if a specific code was not entered within 12 hours. The code, he realized, would likely be on Marcus's personal device, meaning they needed to act before dawn. Against Victoria's protests, Jonathan contacted his most trusted cybersecurity partner, an old college friend named David, who owed him more than one favor, and explained the situation in careful, measured terms. Within an hour, David arrived discreetly, and together they began counter-hacking the remote server, racing against time. Meanwhile, Elena confessed something that deepened the intrigue. She had once dated Marcus years earlier in Chicago, long before working for the Carlyles, and had ended the relationship when she discovered his involvement in illegal data schemes. She had not recognized him immediately when he first came to the estate under the guise of a consultant, but once she did, she understood the danger he posed, and guilt over her past connection had fueled her determination to protect the family. Jonathan absorbed this revelation with complicated gratitude. The woman he had barely noticed was now the linchpin in a high-stakes battle against a criminal mastermind. As the clock ticked, if you think you've heard every rags-to-riches story America can tell, think again, because tonight's story will shake your trust, test your loyalties, and remind you that sometimes the most powerful people are the ones who whisper instead of shout. So before we begin, make sure you hit subscribe and join this channel of unforgettable true-to-life dramas that prove wealth can buy mansions, but never peace of mind. The Millionaire came home early. His maid whispered, "Stay quiet." The reason was shocking. Jonathan Carlyle had built his empire the American way, or at least the version magazines liked to print. A boy from rural Ohio who sold homemade software out of his college dorm room, dropped out at 21, and by 42 owned a cybersecurity company worth nearly $500 million. Complete with interviews on morning talk shows and invitations to Silicon Valley conferences, He lived in a sprawling gated estate outside Boston with tall iron fences, manicured lawns, and a staff that all moved like shadows through polished marble halls. And among that staff was Elena Ruiz, a quiet woman in her early 30s who had worked in the Carlisle household for 3 years, known for her efficiency, her discretion, and her habit of humming old Spanish lullabies while polishing antique furniture. On a Thursday evening that was supposed to find Jonathan in Chicago for a tech summit, his private jet turned around mid-flight due to what he told his pilot was a scheduling miscalculation. But in truth, he had felt a gnawing suspicion since receiving an anonymous email containing only a blurry photograph of his wife Victoria sitting at their dining table with a man Jonathan did not recognize. The timestamp from earlier that week. He had stared at that image at 30,000 feet, heart thudding, pride burning hotter than fear, and decided without warning anyone that he would return home unannounced. It was close to midnight when his car rolled silently through the estate gates. The security guard startled to see him, but too intimidated to ask questions. Jonathan stepped out, still in his tailored navy suit, the night air sharp against his face, and used his own key to unlock the side entrance rather than the grand front doors, a habit from his early days when surprises delighted his children, though now his 2 teenagers were away at boarding school and surprises had grown heavier with consequence. The house was unusually quiet, no lights blazing from Victoria's art studio, no television murmuring from the living room. Jonathan's polished shoes barely made a sound on the marble as he crossed the foyer, and that was when he saw Elena emerging from the hallway that led to his private office, her dark hair tied back, her cleaning caddy in hand, her eyes widening in shock when she recognized him standing there. For a split second, something like fear flashed across her face, not the startled fear of seeing an employer unexpectedly, but a deeper, calculating fear. And before Jonathan could demand an explanation, she placed a finger to her lips and whispered urgently, "Stay quiet." The words were so out of place, so intimate in their command, that Jonathan froze. No one in his world told him to stay quiet. Not board members, not investors, not even his wife. Yet here was his maid, voice trembling but firm, stepping closer as if to shield him from something unseen. He opened his mouth to ask what was going on, but Elena grabbed his wrist with surprising strength and pulled him toward the shadow of the staircase, whispering again, "Please, sir, just listen." Jonathan's first instinct was outrage. How dare she touch him? But the sound that floated down the hallway stopped him cold. A low male voice, unfamiliar, echoing faintly from his office, followed by Victoria's unmistakable laughter, softer than usual, intimate. Jonathan felt his stomach drop, 1,000 humiliating headlines flashing through his mind. But Elena shook her head subtly, as if reading his thoughts, and whispered, "It's not what you think." Those words only fueled his anger. Every betrayed husband in history had heard them, yet Elena's grip tightened, and she leaned close enough that he could smell lemon cleaner on her hands. "They're not alone," she breathed. Before he could process that, another sound drifted toward them, the metallic click of his office safe opening. Jonathan's office safe was biometric, coded to his fingerprint, and a rotating digital key that changed every 72 hours. No one else had access, not even Victoria. His anger shifted instantly from jealousy to alarm, and Elena pulled him farther back as 2 figures emerged from the hallway. Victoria, pale and tense, and a man in a dark jacket holding a small black device. Jonathan recognized the device with horror. It was a portable data extractor used by high-level cybercriminals to clone secure drives. Victoria's eyes were red, as if she had been crying, and she flinched at every movement of the man beside her, who spoke in a low, threatening tone about deadlines and consequences. Jonathan started forward, but Elena held him fast and whispered, "If he sees you, he'll hurt her." Jonathan's mind raced. How could a stranger bypass his biometric safe? Then he noticed the small bandage on Victoria's thumb and understood with a sickening realization that someone had forced her to use his own backup fingerprint scanner stored in the desk drawer, a contingency he had installed in case of injury. The man turned slightly, revealing a face Jonathan dimly recognized from a cybersecurity briefing months earlier. Marcus Hale, a former contractor fired for misconduct, rumored to have ties to an underground hacking ring. Jonathan felt the ground shift beneath him. This was no affair, no romantic betrayal. It was corporate espionage, and his wife was being coerced. Elena whispered that Marcus had been coming to the house for 3 nights, threatening Victoria with fabricated evidence that could implicate Jonathan in insider trading unless she cooperated in copying sensitive files. Elena had overheard.